Hi, I'm Kevin, and this is HFX by Bike, a channel all about getting around Halifax by bike. I make videos showcasing Halifax's bike infrastructure, pointing out what I like and what I don't. Every once in a while, I'll try to redesign one of the infrastructure pieces I've already covered. But some parts of the city don't have any bike infrastructure for me to make videos about in the first place. They're dead zones. If you're traveling by bike, you can either press your luck by going through them, or you can prioritize safety and go around. In today's video, I'll try to clear one of these bike infrastructure deserts, one that obstructs my trips at least 3 times a week, the Armdale Dead Zone. The suburban communities of Armdale and Spryfield sit southwest of the Halifax Peninsula, separated from the urban core by a body of water called the Northwest Arm. This gives the people living in these neighborhoods 2 practical ways of getting to downtown Halifax, via the Armdale Roundabout or via the less direct route along Dunbrack and Highway 102. If you're going by bike, the highway is off limits. That leaves the Armdale Roundabout, an intersection of 5 arterial roads cursed by drivers for time immemorial as one of the most lawless and nerve-wracking places to navigate by car. Legally, you can do this by bike, although it's one of the city's most dangerous places for bikes, so maybe not. There's an alternative route available for bikes that's actually not open to cars, and which makes use of the city's fledgling bike network. Unfortunately, it traces the much more circuitous route of the highway rather than the more direct path of the roundabout. This roughly doubles the length of the trip between Armdale and the peninsula for anyone going by bike. I'm going to go over 3 ways to get bikes between the Armdale and Spryfield neighborhoods and the bike network on the peninsula safely and with competitive travel times. This isn't a let's fix, so I won't be doing any detailed renders, just drawing with magic markers. The first option is what I'm going to call the Armdale Greenway. I have to connect it to the existing network, so I'm going to start off at the Vernon Bikeway between Quinpool and Dalhousie University. The city has a recommended route along the local streets in the neighborhood, running along Shirley, Norwood, and up Woodlawn Terrace to Quinpool. With minimal changes and at low cost, this could become the Norwood Bikeway. The main expense would be the need for a facilitated crossing at Connaught, so that's all pretty easy to implement. Quinpool is a major bottleneck for getting cars in and out of the city, and there's no space to add bike lanes without removing existing lanes for cars. For the sake of argument, I'm going to assume that approach is off the table, so we're going to have to get creative. Here's the existing cross-section for Quinpool west of Woodlawn Terrace. It's a 4-lane road with standard-sized sidewalks on each side. I took measurements using satellite images from multiple different sources, and they all gave roughly the same sizes for the lanes, so I'll go with that. I don't want to take any space away from pedestrians, so I'm going to place a multi-use path along the water-facing side of Quinpool. The city has standard minimum width of 3 meters for multi-use paths, and placing it on the cross-section shows that we come up a little bit short for space. The city also has standards for how wide car lanes should be for different types of roads, and a fun fact about this section of Quinpool is that it looks like its lanes are actually quite a bit too wide. So I'm going to go ahead and bring them back in line with regulations, and oh look, there's now plenty of space for the Armdale Greenway. I've given it a bit of extra space, about ½ meter, because it's there and why not. The Greenway would continue down Quinpool, cutting through the mini park adjacent to the roundabout and heading up Herring Cove Road. This is the most space-constrained part of the design. The road lanes are about as narrow as they can be, and there's a drop off towards the water just past the sidewalk. This can probably be remedied by filling in the slope, but admittedly reshaping the topography would probably be a bit of an ordeal. Armshore Drive is practically a bikeway already, complete with a mode filter partway through. It connects smoothly to the Purcell's Cove painted bike lanes, at which point Armdale and Spryfield are technically connected to the urban cycling network. Yes, I know that Armdale itself is a bit of a dead zone, but that's a different video for another day. At a casual pace of 20 kilometers an hour, this would give someone making a trip from Armdale to the IWK Health Center a travel time of just over 20 minutes, which is competitive with the 24 to 35 minutes estimated trip time for a car during rush hour. For the second option, I'm going to keep the Norwood Bikeway I set up before, and even part of the multi-use path running down the water-facing side of Quinpool, but only as far down as the entrance to Horseshoe Island Park. The park has an existing path that would need to be widened to accommodate bikes and pedestrians moving through it at the same time, but obviously the whole thing is pretty small and doesn't connect to anything. And that's why we're going to infill a ring around the shore of the Northwest Arm to connect Horseshoe Island Park to Regatta Point Park on the opposite side. There's an existing path at Regatta Point that would probably need to be paved to make it serviceable in the winter, but otherwise it's fine and connects to Purcell's Cove Road painted bike lanes, which technically completes this project. The Armdale Seaway would have similar travel times as the Greenway, since they're basically the same path of travel. The small drawback is that while the Greenway can theoretically accommodate anyone moving up or down Quinpool in either direction, the Seaway would really only be accessible from Armdale, and so would generally only be useful for connecting that and surrounding neighborhoods to the peninsula. The real drawback is that infilling would probably be really unpopular and kind of expensive, so there's that. That takes us to the last option. The idea of a bridge over the Northwest Arm has been pretty popular for generations. Here's a sketch of some bridge paths from the 1960s via the Halifax archives to illustrate the point. The appeal is pretty obvious, a direct path between Armdale, Spryfield, and the urban core of the city. The reason why a car bridge over the Northwest Arm never materialized while two bridges were built across Halifax Harbour is probably something to do with the fact that somebody driving from Dartmouth to Halifax without the bridges faces something like a 30-kilometre, 90-minute trip in rush hour traffic. In comparison, going through the Armdale roundabout is less than a 5-kilometre detour relative to crossing the Northwest Arm directly. Bridges for cars are really expensive, and the cost-benefit just doesn't really work here. The calculus changes when you're talking about walking and biking instead of driving, since a 5-kilometre detour is actually pretty substantial outside of a car, and the cost of building a bridge is much lower when the heaviest thing that needs to cross it is a snowblower instead of a 3-ton pickup doing 80 kilometers an hour. The location of the bridge is pretty important. If it's too close to the roundabout, then it just becomes redundant with it and essentially just a more expensive version of the Greenway and Seaway options from before. If it's too close to where the Arm meets the ocean, we're moving the path of travel away from both the existing population and job centers and towards a park, which limits the utility of the bridge for transportation. The entire point of the bridge is to create a new, more direct right of way for bikes and pedestrians. The best placement, as far as I can tell, is around the halfway point between the two, which is coincidentally the narrowest part of the Arm. This path of travel would have the bridge running between Oakland Road on the peninsula side and Dingle Road on the mainland side, which seems to be the consensus of basically everyone who's ever thought about it, since even the early plans for a car bridge used the same placement. Me and the 1960s urban planners aren't alone here. A team of engineering students at Dalhousie University took it upon themselves to actually design a bike and pedestrian bridge at this exact crossing point as part of a capstone project back in 2018. Their design is set up to be tall enough to allow even tall ships to pass underneath it without issue, which is good because otherwise this kind of project would be a non-starter for this part of the city. The design is based on the Bob Carey Bridge in Omaha, Nebraska, in case you wanted a real-world example of what this kind of thing would look like. There's a link to the full poster for this project in the description of this video, and I highly recommend that you check it out. A direct bridge crossing would generate travel times that aren't just competitive with driving, but flat-out superior. A bike traveling from Armdale to the IWK in rush hour traffic would arrive in just under 15 minutes, and arrive downtown in probably less than 20. The main drawbacks to a bridge are the cost and public visibility. The student team gave an estimate of $19 million back in 2018. We've had several years of high inflation since then, so I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's going to be quite a bit more expensive nowadays. The bridge is also highly visible and would likely generate a lot of negative attention, primarily because, well, there's not a bridge there currently, and so adding one would make something different. Those are 3 ways of closing out the Armdale Dead Zone. Let me know in the comments which you'd prefer, or if you have any other ideas that you think could work. Or, if there are any other dead zones around the city that you'd like to see addressed, let me know and I might make it into a video someday. As always, thanks for watching, and see you next time.